The year is 1866. As settlers and soldiers push westward into the northern plains, they encounter a people whose name would become legendary in the annals of the American frontier. The Oglala Sioux, masters of the horse, hunters of the buffalo, and warriors whose courage would challenge an empire. Their story is not merely a footnote in the conquest of the West, but a defining chapter in America's most mythic era. Today, we ride through the dust of history to witness the Oglala's desperate struggle to preserve their way of life against the relentless tide of a changing world. Before the iron horse cut across the prairie, and long before wagon trains carved their dusty trails west, the Oglala people roamed free across the northern plains. These weren't just any wandering folk. They were the elite horsemen of the mighty Lakota nation, one of the 7 council fires that burned bright across the vast grasslands. The Oglala's domain stretched from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains, a sea of grass where the horizon itself seemed to bow before them. This was no empty wilderness, as the white man would later claim. This was Oglala country, alive, sacred, and teeming with purpose. When the Spanish Mustangs found their way north in the 1700s, the very soul of the Oglala was transformed. What once took days now took hours. What once seemed impossible became their birthright. The horse wasn't merely a beast of burden, but a brother in arms, an extension of the warrior himself. The Oglala called them Shunkawakang, sacred dogs, and with their arrival, the people became as swift as the wind and as deadly as the prairie lightning. At the heart of Oglala, life stood the buffalo, the tatanka. More than mere sustenance, the great beasts were walking storehouses that provided everything from meat and marrow to shelter and clothing. The massive herds, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of thousands, thundered across the plains in migrations that shook the very earth. The skilled Oglala hunters could bring down these 1-ton beasts with arrows that flew true from horseback at full gallop, a sight that would later leave even hardened frontier soldiers slack-jawed in amazement. Around evening fires, as the prairie wind whispered through the teepees, Oglala elders spoke of Wakantanka, the great mystery, and how all things were connected in the sacred hoop of life. Young men listened intently, dreaming of the day they might earn their place in the distinguished warrior societies, the Kit Foxes, the Brave Hearts, or the prestigious Strong Hearts. These weren't mere social clubs, but the backbone of Oglala military might and social order. Women commanded respect as the keepers of the camp, their skilled hands transforming buffalo hides into supple leather, crafting intricate beadwork that told stories without words, and raising children to honor the old ways. The winters were harsh taskmasters, but the Oglala had mastered survival in a land where each season brought new challenges and blessings alike. At the center of their world stood Paha Sapa, the Black Hills, rising from the plains like dark islands in a golden sea. More than mere mountains, these pine-covered peaks were the very center of creation, a place where the morning star kissed the earth each dawn. Here, young men sought visions, fasting alone until the spirits revealed their purpose. Here, the thunder beings spoke in summer storms, and the sacred waters flowed with healing power. In these days before the coming of the blue-coated soldiers and gold-hungry miners, the Oglala followed the rhythms of nature. Their calendar was not marked by arbitrary numbers, but by the world around them. The moon when leaves break forth, the moon of red cherries, the moon when the geese shed their feathers. Time itself breathed differently here. When other tribes encroached on their hunting grounds, the Oglala fought with a ferocity that became legendary across the plains. Their war parties could travel 100 miles in a day, strike with devastating precision, and vanish like morning mist. Yet they were not mindless warriors, but shrewd strategists who valued courage and honor above all else. Little did they know that far to the east, in places they had never seen, men gazed westward with hungry eyes. The storm clouds of change were gathering on the horizon, and the old ways of the Oglala would soon face their greatest test. But for now, they remained the undisputed lords of the northern plains, free as the eagle that soared above them in the endless blue sky. The 1850s dawned blood-red on the plains. What began as a trickle of white faces heading west had swelled to a torrent by mid-century. Wagons creaked along the Oregon Trail, cutting a wound through the heart of Oglala hunting grounds. The white man's settlements sprouted like unwelcome weeds along riverbanks, where the Oglala had camped for generations. The first whispers of trouble became a deafening roar. The Great Father in Washington spoke with a forked tongue. Treaties were signed with solemn promises, only to be broken when gold fever or land hunger struck the white settlers. The Oglala, who considered a man's word his sacred bond, watched in mounting fury as each agreement crumbled to dust. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 had recognized Oglala claims to vast territories, but the ink had barely dried before trespassers ignored its boundaries. In the summer of 1854, near Fort Laramie, the storm clouds broke. A lame cow, belonging to a Mormon emigrant, wandered into an Oglala camp. When a visiting Miniconjou Sioux shot the beast for food, as was custom with stray animals on the plains, Lieutenant John Grattan led a detachment of soldiers to arrest the thief. The young officer, fresh from West Point and eager to make his mark, rode into the Oglala camp with cannons and contempt. High Forehead, an aging chief, attempted to negotiate. He offered a horse as fair payment for the cow. Grattan would have none of it. Words grew heated. A translator full of whiskey and malice mistranslated deliberately. Within minutes, gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, Grattan and his 30 men lay dead. High Forehead, mortally wounded, used his dying breath to urge peace, knowing the blue coats would return with vengeance in their hearts, and return they did. General William Harney, known to the Plains tribes as the Butcher, led a punitive expedition that culminated in the slaughter of Little Thunder's band at Blue Water Creek. Women and children fell alongside warriors as the soldiers showed little mercy. The lesson was clear. The Great Father's patience had run thin, and the old way of life hung by a thread. Through these blood-soaked years, a leader emerged from the Oglala ranks. Red Cloud, Makpialuta, had earned his warrior credentials decades earlier, counting coup 80 times against tribal enemies. Now in his 40s, with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, he recognized that the tribe faced its greatest challenge. Not just a fighter, Red Cloud possessed the rare gift of strategic thinking. In council meetings, his voice grew in authority as the situation darkened. They make many promises, he observed of the white negotiators, more than I can remember. But they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they took it. By the early 1860s, while blue and gray armies tore at each other's throats back east, a different kind of pressure mounted on the plains. Gold discoveries in Montana meant more traffic through Oglala territory. The Bozeman Trail threatened to split the last great hunting grounds. Pony soldiers built forts where once only Oglala teepees had stood. The younger warriors grew restless, their hearts burning for revenge. The Oglala had always valued patience, watching the seasons turn, knowing when to strike and when to wait. But even the patience of the Lakota had limits. As women struggled to feed their children on diminishing rations and shrinking hunting grounds, the warrior societies met in secret councils. Other tribes felt the same pressure. Runners moved between camps. Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other Sioux bands spoke of joining forces. Ancient rivalries were set aside in the face of a common enemy. The scattered resistance needed focus, leadership, a plan. Red Cloud watched, listened, and waited for his moment. When miners and soldiers pushed too far into the Powder River country in 1866, cutting the heart from the last great hunting territory, he made his decision. The time for talk had ended. The time for war had come. The Oglala would fight not just for land, but for their very existence as a people. The summer of 1866 hung heavy over the Powder River country. 3 forts now stood like splinters in the flesh of Oglala territory, guarding the Bozeman Trail as it sliced through the last great hunting grounds. Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, a chain of military outposts strung along a road the Oglala never asked for and never wanted. Red Cloud's declaration at the Fort Laramie peace talks still echoed across the plains. The white man lies and steals. My lodges were many, but now they are few. The white man wants all. They must fight for it. With those words, he had stormed from the negotiations, refusing to touch the pen to any treaty while soldiers occupied the Powder River country. What followed was no ordinary Indian war. This was not a series of raids followed by swift retreat. Red Cloud orchestrated something unprecedented, a coordinated military campaign against the United States Army at the height of its post-Civil War power. Seasoned veterans who had survived Gettysburg and Shiloh now found themselves facing an entirely different kind of warfare. By late autumn, Fort Phil Kearny stood under virtual siege. No firewood party ventured out without heavy guard. No courier rode without expecting arrows. The soldiers huddled behind their stockade walls, while Oglala scouts watched their every move from distant ridgelines. Captain William Fetterman, recently arrived and full of contempt, boasted, "Give me 80 men and I'll ride through the whole Sioux nation." He would soon have his chance. On the bitter cold morning of December 21st, 1866, the fort's wood train came under attack. Fetterman demanded the chance to drive off the attackers. Colonel Carrington reluctantly assented, but gave strict orders not to pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Pride and inexperience proved a deadly combination. The captain, with his 80 soldiers, thundered out the gates. What awaited was no random war party, but a masterpiece of tactical planning. Crazy Horse, a young Oglala warrior of rising reputation, led a small decoy team that feigned retreat, drawing the soldiers farther from the fort. Fetterman, unable to resist the bait, crossed the forbidden ridge in hot pursuit. In a snow-filled ravine beyond the ridge waited nearly 2,000 warriors, Oglala, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, concealed like shadows in the winter landscape. When the trap sprung, it closed with devastating efficiency. The entire detachment perished in under 30 minutes. No white man survived to tell the tale of what became known as the Fetterman Massacre, or to the Oglala, their greatest victory yet. Back east, newspaper headlines screamed of savagery. But on the plains, warriors celebrated a masterful military achievement. Red Cloud had proven that the Pony Soldiers were not invincible, that united resistance could succeed. Throughout 1867, attacks continued unabated. Supply wagons were ambushed, couriers killed, livestock stolen. The forts became islands in a hostile sea, slowly starving for resources. The war was hitting the Great Father's pocketbook hard. Military estimates suggested it cost the government $2 million to kill a single Indian. an expense that even the wealthiest nation could ill afford. Meanwhile, the Transcontinental Railroad neared completion, promising a route to Montana that would bypass the contested Bozeman Trail entirely. By 1868, a new peace commission arrived at Fort Laramie. This time, they came not with demands, but concessions. The terms were unprecedented. The Army would abandon the three hated forts, the Bozeman Trail would be closed, and the entire Powder River country would be recognized as unceded Indian territory, land where no white man could legally settle. Only when the last soldier marched out and the fort stood empty did Red Cloud finally ride in to sign the treaty. As the abandoned Fort Phil Kearny burned behind him, the smoke rising like a victory signal to the heavens, he became the only Indian leader in American history to win a war against the United States. The victory would prove temporary, but its significance remained eternal. For a brief, shining moment, the Oglala had stemmed the tide of westward expansion. They had fought not as savages, but as brilliant strategists defending their homeland. And they had won on their own terms, forcing the most powerful nation on earth to retreat from their sacred hunting grounds. The ink on the Fort Laramie Treaty dried, promising peace. But peace came with a bitter price. The Great Sioux Reservation now confined a people born to roam, their territory shrinking like a buffalo hide in the summer sun. Yet the treaty had preserved the Powder River country and the sacred Black Hills as hunting grounds, for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers flow. Words that would prove as ephemeral as morning mist. For a time, the old ways continued. When summer painted the plains with wildflowers, many Oglala families slipped away from the agencies with their government-issued permits clutched tightly. They erected their teepees along familiar streams where their ancestors had camped for generations. The earth still trembled beneath massive buffalo herds, though keen-eyed hunters noticed their numbers dwindling year by year. These hunts were not merely for sustenance, but for survival of a way of life. Young men who had never counted coup against an enemy could still prove their worth by facing the thundering Tatanka with nothing but bow and arrow. Women still stretched hides across willow frames, their skilled hands transforming rough skin into supple leather for moccasins and lodge covers. Children still learned the ancient ways, which plants healed, which berries nourished, how to read the weather in cloud patterns and animal behavior. The heartbeat of Oglala culture still pulsed strong, but shadows lengthened across this twilight world. Trains now sliced through the prairie, disgorging hide hunters by the hundreds. These men, armed with heavy Sharps rifles that could drop a buffalo at unthinkable distances, left carcasses rotting in the sun, taking only the hides and tongues, leaving the meat that the Oglala considered sacred to feed the ravens and wolves. By 1871, buffalo bones bleached the plains like scattered monuments to a vanishing era. Then came the fateful summer of 1874. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, his yellow hair gleaming in the sun, led an expedition into the heart of Paha Sapa, the Black Hills. Newspapermen rode alongside soldiers, their telegraphed reports setting the east ablaze with whispers of gold among the roots of the grass. Words that were death sentences for Oglala freedom. Within months, miners swarmed the hills like ants on spilled sugar, heedless of treaty promises. The Great Father in Washington made half-hearted attempts to keep them out, then offered to buy the sacred mountains. When Lakota leaders refused, officials shrugged and let the tide of prospectors flow unhindered. The most sacred covenant lay shattered. Away from the reservation, in the free northern hunting grounds, two leaders emerged as symbols of unyielding resistance. Sitting Bull of the Hunkpapa and Crazy Horse of the Oglala. Their camps became magnets for young warriors whose hearts burned with the desire to live as their fathers had lived, free from the agents' ration cards and arbitrary rules. Back at the agencies, families were torn. Remain with the progressive faction under leaders like Spotted Tail, who recognized that adaptation offered the only path to survival, or slip away to join the free bands, knowing it meant choosing a path of hardship and likely bloodshed. Many young men made their choice in the dark of night, riding northward toward Sitting Bull's camp despite the tears of mothers who sensed they might never return. In Washington, patience wore thin. In December 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued an ultimatum. All Indians must report to their agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. The deadline came during the moon of strong cold, when waist-deep snow made travel impossible for camps with women, children, and elders. The government had demanded the impossible, then prepared for war when the impossible wasn't delivered. As the harsh winter of 1875 to 76 gave way to spring, the last truly free Oglala bands followed the dwindling buffalo herds across the Powder River country. Hunting parties still rode out at dawn, but now they scanned the horizon for more than game. They watched for the dust clouds that would announce the coming of soldiers. The old men, reading signs in the natural world, spoke of visions dark with foreboding. Along the Yellowstone, Tongue, and Rosebud rivers, thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered in one of the largest concentrations of Plains tribes ever seen. They came for the buffalo, for freedom, for one last summer to live as the Creator intended. Instead, they were riding into the whirlwind of history. Spring of 1876 brought not just renewal to the northern plains, but war. From three directions, columns of bluecoats marched toward the great gathering of tribes along the Yellowstone. General Crook from the south, Colonel Gibbon from the west, and General Terry, with Custer's 7th Cavalry, from the east. Three massive hammers meant to smash the last free bands against a military anvil. The first clash came in March, when Crook's forces attacked a village believing it to be Crazy Horse's camp. Instead, they found themselves battling Cheyenne under two moons at Powder River. Though the soldiers retreated, they had awakened the hornet's nest. By June, when Crook pressed northward again, Crazy Horse was ready. At the Battle of the Rosebud, nearly 1,000 Oglala and Cheyenne warriors struck with such fury that the celebrated general was forced to withdraw. His campaign stalled before it truly began. 8 days later, on the greasy grass that white men called the Little Bighorn, destiny awaited. Custer, ignoring warnings about the unprecedented size of the Indian encampment, divided his forces and charged headlong toward his immortality. What followed was not merely a battle, but an unleashing of generations of Oglala fury. Crazy Horse, then just 35 winters old, rode into combat with his face painted with hailstones, his hair unbraided, and a single hawk feather tied in his lock. No ordinary war leader, he had long been known for his medicine dreams and strange powers. "Today is a good day to die," came his cry as he led a massive flanking maneuver that crushed Custer's right. Witnesses said he rode straight into the soldiers' fire, bullets and arrows seemingly unable to find him as he cut through the blue line like a prairie twister. When the guns fell silent, over 260 soldiers lay dead across the hillsides above the river. The victory was complete, unprecedented, and ultimately Pyrrhic. For the Great Father's response came swift and terrible. The nation, celebrating its centennial that very summer, reacted with shock and calls for vengeance. Thousands more troops poured onto the plains. The great village broke into smaller bands, their victory celebrations short-lived as reality set in. Winter was coming, and with it, a campaign unlike any they had faced before. Through the moon of falling leaves and into the bitter cold, the army relentlessly pursued the scattered bands. No longer would soldiers withdraw to winter quarters while Indians regrouped. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, Colonel Nelson Miles, and others led their men through blizzards and across frozen rivers, striking villages when families were most vulnerable. In January 1877, soldiers found Crazy Horse's village along the Tongue River. Women and children fled into the killing cold as warriors fought a desperate rearguard action. Lodges, food stores, and buffalo robes, everything needed for winter survival, went up in flames. The band survived, but starvation and exposure claimed more lives than bullets. As spring whispered its return, the free bands faced impossible choices. Their horses were gaunt from lack of forage, their children hollow-eyed with hunger. The buffalo were gone, the wild game hunted out. Even Sitting Bull, the defiant one, led his followers across the medicine line into Grandmother's Land, Canada, seeking refuge. On May 6, 1877, Crazy Horse led 900 starving followers into the Red Cloud Agency near Fort Robinson. The great war chief came in proudly, not in surrender but in calculated acceptance of changing times. His people needed food, needed shelter, needed a place to survive. He had fought with all his medicine, all his courage, and now he would find a way to lead in peace. The government wanted him neutralized, perhaps sent to Indian territory, or even to the distant waters of the Wakpatanka, the Atlantic, where troublesome chiefs were held at Fort Marion. Rumors and misunderstandings swirled through the summer months. Indian scouts loyal to the Bluecoats whispered that Crazy Horse planned escape, planned renewed war, planned to kill officials. On September 5, 1877, just 4 months after coming in from the cold prairie, Crazy Horse was led to what he believed would be a council meeting. Instead, he found himself being forced toward the guardhouse, prison. The warrior who had never been contained would not be caged. In the struggle that followed, a bayonet found his kidney. Before the next dawn, with his father singing the death song beside him, the greatest Oglala warrior breathed his last. With his passing, the old free ways of the Oglala breathed their last as well. The Great Sioux War had not ended with a decisive battle, but with a slow strangulation of a way of life. The years following Crazy Horse's death brought a silence to the plains that spoke volumes. The once proud Oglala, masters of the northern prairie, found themselves confined to the Pine Ridge Agency in the southwestern corner of Dakota Territory. Their vast hunting grounds had shrunk to a reservation where muddy creeks replaced the mighty rivers of their memory. Government rations, often rancid beef, weevil-infested flour, and coffee barely fit for consumption, replaced the buffalo that had sustained them for generations. The Indian agent, political appointee that he was, ruled Pine Ridge with arbitrary power that would have made the most tyrannical Eastern mayor blush. Children were forced into agency schools where their hair was shorn, their mouths washed with lye soap for speaking their mother tongue. Their very names changed to suit the white man's tongue. James, John, and Mary replaced names that had meaning, names that spoke of brave deeds, natural beauty, or spiritual connection. Yet beneath the seeming compliance, the Oglala spirit remained unbroken. In sweat lodges hidden from agency police, medicine men still prayed in the old way. Grandmothers whispered stories to children in the dark of night, passing down histories no government textbook would ever contain. The seeds of resistance merely went dormant, waiting for the right conditions to sprout anew. Those conditions arrived in 1889, carried by a Paiute holy man named Wovoka from distant Nevada. His message spread like prairie fire through native encampments. A new Messiah had come with promises that performing the sacred ghost dance would bring back the buffalo, cause the white men to disappear, and reunite the living with their deceased ancestors. The earth would cover over all the white man's works, and the ancestors would return, bringing the old free days with them. At Pine Ridge, the message found fertile ground. By 1890, with reservation rations cut to starvation levels and a devastating drought searing the land, the ghost dance offered hope where none existed. Dancers wore sacred shirts painted with symbols believed to stop bullets. Day and night, the songs rose from hidden ravines beyond the agent's view. The father says, "When your friends die, they are not dead. They live in another world. They will return. You shall live. The buffalo shall return. My children, I tell you this." White settlers, peering from distant homesteads, saw only the frenzied movements of wild Indians preparing for war. Newspaper headlines screamed of imminent uprising. Dakota farmers abandoned homesteads and fled to towns. The agent at Pine Ridge, Daniel F. Royer, earned the Lakota name Young Man Afraid of Indians for his panicked telegrams begging for military intervention. The War Department responded by dispatching nearly half the U.S. Army to the Sioux agencies. By December 1890, more than 3,000 troops surrounded Pine Ridge. Ghost dancers fled to the Badlands, creating a hostile camp beyond Army reach. Meanwhile, 40 miles north at the Cheyenne River Agency, Sitting Bull, who had returned from Canadian exile years earlier, was assassinated by Indian police during a botched arrest attempt on December 15th. His followers, terrified, fled south toward Pine Ridge. Among them was a band led by Bigfoot, an aging chief suffering from pneumonia. Intercepted by the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment seeking redemption, Bigfoot's band was escorted to Wounded Knee Creek on December 28th. The next morning, as soldiers began confiscating weapons, a deaf tribesman named Black Coyote refused to surrender his rifle. In the struggle that followed, a shot rang out. What happened next was not battle, but butchery. 4 Hotchkiss mountain guns, positioned on the hillsides, opened fire on the camp. Men, women, and children fell under the barrage of bullets that knew no distinction of age or gender. Those who fled were hunted through the snow. When the guns finally fell silent, more than 250 Lakota lay dead or dying in the frozen creek bed. A 3-day blizzard covered the twisted bodies with nature's shroud. When the storm lifted, a burial party of civilians arrived from the Holy Cross Episcopal Mission. What they found haunted them for life. Frozen bodies contorted in death throes, women with babies still wrapped in their shawls, children whose small fingers had clawed at the snow as they bled their last. At Wounded Knee, more than a battle was lost. An era ended. The frontier the government had declared closed in 1890 was truly sealed with Lakota blood. The Old West, with all its terrible beauty and fierce freedom, gave its last dying gasp in that snow-filled ravine. Yet the Oglala survived. Through the darkness of the coming century, they held to the fragments of their culture like precious heirlooms, preserving what could be preserved, adapting what needed to change. Their story reminds us that the true American frontier was never just about white settlement pushing westward. It was about the collision of worlds, the resistance of a people defending their way of life, and a legacy that continues to shape our understanding of the American West to this day.